Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 685, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. This is interview number 4, being recorded on August 16th of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just out in softcover from City Light Books. Elizabeth, Paul, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's great to be back.
Thanks, Dave.
As we're talking on, well, you know what, first give your website, and then let's go traipsing through Afghanistan, which a lot of people have tried to do with varying degrees of success.
Okay, the website's invisiblehistory.com. That's it.
All righty. And over the course of the previous 3 hours that we've spent together, we've delved into a lot of the subject material of your book. For people that don't know much about Afghanistan, and I basically have to include myself in that category, it provides a pretty detailed history of that country, going way, way, way back, and then sort of brings it up through the present. But we've taken a look at how the Soviet march to the Middle East, supposedly going somehow through Afghanistan, was actually manufactured. It was a propaganda ploy. And we've taken a look at Team B and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the luring in and the trapping of the Soviets. Then we've looked at UNICAL and some of the corporate interests who began picking up the thread from that point. We've taken a look at the Pakistanis. We've taken a look at the tremendous role that the narcotics traffic has played in this entire concatenation from the period leading up to the Soviet invasion through the entire Mujahideen war against the Red Army, right on up through the present, and how the current Afghan government has many of its top officials astride the heroin trade. Your book is very critical of U.S. policy, and beyond that, it's a very sober, detailed critique of said U.S. policy. Yet I think that in the chapter where you say, what can President Obama do, and I'd like to focus on that in a big way, you do not do something that I'd wager most of the listeners who've heard our previous 3 hours together would have thought that you were in favor of an outright withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in fact, at one point you highlight the deadly futility of attempting to negotiate with the Taliban, which a lot of people have tried to do with no success whatsoever. Let's take a look at what you recommend to President Obama and what you feel should be done in light of what you've presented in the book. And at some point before we wrap this interview, I'd like you to give this series of interviews what you do in your book, which is a 21st chapter. And I'm going to have you explain, when we get to that point in the interview, I'm going to have you explain what the 21st chapter means in the context specifically of your book so that listeners will understand that. You speak directly to President Obama and his policies there. Let's talk about that. What do you recommend? Just sort of go marching through Georgia, so to speak. What do you recommend to President Obama?
Well, I think at this point, we've been looking at this crisis in Afghanistan going back to, in terms of U.S. policy being directly involved, going back to the Carter administration. And so we can see the hand of policy being really the problem. And in terms of correcting Obama's policy, we can see that this lineage that has gone back so far, really, it is as if it's handed over generationally, that it really doesn't matter Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. These things really make no difference in terms of the overarching direction of the policy. And I think we've now seen that transition from George Bush, who, of course, in basically underfinancing and really underfocusing on Afghanistan in any genuine way, really created the crisis that Obama was handed. So now we've got Obama. Well, Obama seems to be replicating a lot of the same problems. And as we see it at this point, the best example of that, of course, was the hue and cry over civilian casualties. We've been hearing this as one of the major concerns. The Afghan people also have been subjected to, since 2001, when the Americans came in and the Europeans came in terms of reconstruction, really not completing reconstruction. So once again, we've got a lot of complex issues here. And that's why when we hear this talk about the U.S. withdrawal, okay, it isn't so much that we certainly recognize that there is no military solution to this, but we're talking now about a situation that has really, this is like you've got a blown up building, okay? And you've really got to bring in some major reconstruction to rebuild it, okay? This is the Afghan civil society. This has not been done. You have got porous borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Pakistan is actively still allowing the Islamists to go over their border, and the Taliban, and supporting the Taliban and all of the abuses that are going on. So you've got a lot of problems that are still really going to be a continuing problem, whether the U.S. continues what it's doing right now or whether the U.S. withdraws. This is still going to be a continuing problem. So the real issue is, what should the United States do to actually try and correct what is going on? And that is where we see a schism in U.S. policy, U.S. stated goals, and what we actually see on the ground. And that is where, we get very, I think, there have been so many common sense and obvious recommendations over the last 20 years. We really have to start asking the question, why isn't it that any administration can actually implement these obvious solutions to the problem?
I'm going to go and look at the points that we do when we sum up, Dave. And the first point that we make to President Obama is that the United States stopped killing Afghans. That's a complex story, as we know. Okay, well, the Afghans are a friend of ours who was involved in the reconstruction effort very early on. At one point expressed amazement. He's an Afghan, and he said, I don't understand why the United States is conducting these bombing raids in these outlying areas of Afghanistan. He said, the United States isn't at war with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is America's ally. So, but the fact is that the United States is acting as if it's at war with Afghanistan. In fact, what the United States is acting as if it's at war with the Pashtun majority of Afghanistan, and that comes down to British policy in the 19th century. The Anglo-Saxon world, and that's how they refer to themselves, the Anglo-Saxon financial industry, the Anglo-Saxon military industry, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada. Britain has been waging war on the Pashtun population of Afghanistan, which was the ruling population of Afghanistan, since 1839. I will read you something that is just in front of me. This is an extract from a report of the East India Company, a committee on the causes and consequences of the first Afghan war. This was written during its progress. This was written during the progress of the war in 1839 to 1842. Quote, "This war of robbery is waged by the English government through the intervention of the government of India, without the knowledge of England or of the Parliament or the Court of Directors, thereby evading the checks placed by the Constitution on the exercise of the prerogative of the Crown in declaring war. It presents, therefore, a new crime in the annals of nations, a secret war. It has been made by a people without their knowledge against another people who had committed no offense." Now, Liz, you've got a quote here from Alexander Burns that was written.
Right. This actually, Alexander Burns was a political officer for the East India Company, and he was in advance of really, getting the British Empire was already in the region during the early 19th century. This was around 1832 when he was interacting with the Afghan people, and he was sending home his opinion of his experience. And this was in a letter sent by to his mother, May of 1832. Quote, "The people of this country are kind-hearted and hospitable. They have no prejudice against a Christian and none against our nation." Now you have to then put that up against, here, 1832, against the recommendation of Alexander Burns, which was to work with these people to really help create a strong Afghanistan, which would be the best advice he could give to the British Empire to help support the British Empire's goals in the region. And instead, in 1839, the British decided to prosecute their first war against the Afghan people. And that started the legacy that we really see has been handed down generationally, the attitude that we're looking at, which constantly views the Afghan people as a people to subjugate. The idea that they could actually be stronger as friends never enters into the discussion. That they could be stronger as partners never enters into the discussion. And yet this statement by Alexander Burns makes very clear that for those people who see that opportunity, it is very palpable.
So you can see, beginning in 1839, this kind of secret war, which was an illegal war, conducted by the British East India Company on Afghanistan without the knowledge of the British government, established a kind of precedent when it comes to either and both, the United States and Britain, in terms of the kind of wars that have become commonplace now. The United States does not declare wars. It just simply says, well, we're going to send troops into an area for whatever reasons. And this has become the way and the engagement under which we were in Vietnam, and this is the way we are engaged in Afghanistan at this particular time. The problem is that, as it was pointed out by Alexander Burns in 1832, and again later on as he came to know the Afghan situation even better, and then again in 1879, later on when the British waged their second war against Afghanistan, that a strong central government in Afghanistan working with the Afghan people, working with the Pashtun people, was a much more realistic and sensible agenda, even for imperialists, than it was. I mean, even for pacifists, this is a non-issue. But even for imperialists, it was a better deal to work with these tribal people than it was to try to overcome them. No one has been able to overcome these people in thousands of years, and at the end of all of this, whenever the West tires of its involvement in warfare in that region, these Pashtuns will still be there. They'll still be inhabiting the same territory that they have always inhabited. So the first rule of thumb, as we felt, was to simply stop killing these people, and then from there, get these people on your side. And in doing so, the president would need to stop humiliating Afghans. One of the things that has gone on during the Bush administration, I mean, all you have to do in terms of the issue, you think about the so-called war on terror when Ari Fleischer stood up in front of a press conference originally after 9/11 and said, you'd better be careful what you say. Well, I mean, this is such an entirely un-American concept. You better be careful what you say or we'll come and get you. I mean, the whole idea, and this was taken from here. I mean, even today, going to the airport with the whole nature of the shakedown that you're put through. The fact that human rights are thrown right out the window under the assumption that you could be a, quote, terrorist. Well, terror is a concept. And that was kind of, we've crossed so many thresholds since the end of World War II and the creation of the Cold War and the creation of the national intelligence state that, we've all grown used to this idea of accepting, people reading our mail and listening to our phone conversations. And now, of course, intercepting our email and scanning our email for certain words and phrases. I mean, as I said, this is what's so interesting is that the conservatives are blamed for many of these, are the ones who claim that these things are necessary, and yet these are the things that actually were the very definition of what it meant to be an American, to have those kind of rights. It's why people from all over the world came here. We had an experience a few years ago in which a Pakistani woman, a doctor, said to me that she had been raised in Pakistan and she said she had felt oppressed her whole life until she came to the United States and she finally could lift up her head as an individual. And she said after 9/11, she said she began to feel as if she was in the same country as Pakistan. She felt as if she was in no different condition in terms of her rights as an individual, her freedoms, her liberties. Everything became subject to government questions about her ideas, her thoughts, and what she would do under certain circumstances. So, humiliating Afghan men, desecrating their homes, these are the kinds of things that just reverberate through the Afghan society. And not only that, I mean, the Afghans are more like us than we are. They're independent, they're flinty, they don't like to be interfered with when it comes to their individual beliefs and their individual rights.
I think also we have to realize that if Americans actually were subjected to what the Afghan people had been subjected to by the American military, they would be taking up arms against whoever was doing it to them. We're talking about, this is what is, really people's homes basically being invaded in the middle of the night, people being put up against, walls and humiliated, in ways that without any real clear benefit clearly to the people for this process, and that too often the actual process itself literally only alienated the local populations. And in fact, some cases it turned out that there were individuals who knowingly gave the military bad information so that they would go and then terrorize some other person that they want to terrorize. So it really became so obvious that the U.S. military should never have engaged in these kinds of practices in the first place.
And the fact is, too, of course, that, here these people have been under attack from British armies, Anglo-Saxon armies, since 1839. And here they're now occupied by Anglo-Saxon armies once again, kicking down doors in the middle of the night, bombing Pashtun villages, doing exactly the same thing that they were doing in 1839 and 1879 and 1919, and the same thing that the Russians did when they occupied the country for 10 years, from 1979 until 1989. So, once again, you have to say, well, if you really want to solve the situation, then you'll stop doing some of these heinous practices towards the people that you're trying to win over. Now, it does appear as if some of the new regime, General Stanley McChrystal, who has gone in, has pronounced quite loudly that his objective is changing the operation from a counter-terror operation to a counterinsurgency operation, which means making sure that security for villages is established, is maintained.
I think it's called secure, build, and hold.
Secure, build, and hold.
The idea that they really need to create a trinity of powerful effects that can guarantee ultimately, which really is needed, the rebuilding of the economy, because one of the major crises we have in Afghanistan today is the fact that there's over a 40% unemployment rate, and that has a lot to do with any kind of gangsterism or terrorism or any of these things holding any sway at all, because you really have so many people who are not able to get enough work to feed their families, basically.
You speak specifically. The first recommendation, of course, we've already talked about, which is to stop killing Afghans. And you also mentioned, and this is directly contiguous to what you just spoke about, on page 317, stop humiliating Afghan men and desecrating their homes. Whoever introduced Rafael Patai's book, The Arab Mind, as a guide for interrogating Muslim men through sexual humiliation should be put on trial for inciting terrorism. Develop that a little more for us, and then if you would tick off the various points that you make, because you have a number of, you literally numbered a bunch of different recommendations that you make, and if you could encapsulate those for us, I think it'd give the audience a view as to what you really think needs to be done.
Well, Rafael Patai was a Middle East scholar who came out with a book back in the 1970s called The Arab Mind. And it was about what motivated Arab men. And it kind of put them in a very specific framework. That what's interesting is that a very short time after his book was published, it really became, in anthropological circles, it really became kind of a not taken very serious work. It was not taken very seriously by people who looked at it. They really didn't think that it was more of an antiquated, almost 19th century neo-colonial look at the way the West addressed the Middle East. Of course, when you get into the 1970s and the oil bonanza that was going on with the Middle East, I mean, you've got an entirely two generations of Middle Eastern businessmen and royalty who've come to American universities, and Harvard University, Tufts University is filled with the children of interestingly enough, even the Bin Laden family was Boston, Cambridge was very popular with the Bin Laden family during the 1980s and 90s, and right till the run-up of 2001. So you're dealing with an entirely different kind of mentality there, and this was a very primitive way to look at it. But what happened is that when the Bush administration came in, these old ideas, these old neo-colonial ideas, kind of gained a popularity inside certain sects within the military.
The neocons were particularly, anti-Islamic, so this has certainly played right into that. And the idea that Islam really is not a legitimate religion, it also played into Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which was really trying to define the future crisis points in the world as coming between fundamental belief systems that really were represented by these, civilizations, and Islam represented literally a competing, way of framing the world that was really against sort of this this sort of Christian, Judeo-Christian view of the world. So these ideas really played right into this idea of, for instance, invading Iraq to then bring democracy and reframing the whole region, the whole Islamic world. It just played right into it. So you're looking really at, sort of the final stage of people experiencing the real meaning of what that was all about.
I'm going to go through. The next point that we make is calling people with a better understanding of the problem from a diversity of the Afghan political perspective and take their advice seriously. Washington think tanks and a handful of Eastern elite universities dominate U.S. planning in Afghanistan. Well, that still tends to be very much the position, unfortunately.
We really do have effectively a Pakistani lobby that really has held sway over the sort of the beltway, the intelligentsia in the United States. Now that really happened when you look at the original relationship that was established once the British left Pakistan in place pretty much as a military stronghold in the region and really helped to create the Pakistani ISI, the intelligence aspects of the military, and to really leave in place what the United States simply picked up that became part of the framework of the Cold War scenario. So suddenly, this new country formed, 5/8 out of Afghanistan and India, the rest India, suddenly is center stage in the region because of its relationship with the United States. So it really began to establish very early on some very high-level relationships, and its own agenda and perspective really just held sway. Well, we're looking at that continuing at this late stage, that this really never shifted. But when you actually look at Pakistan's agenda, when you look back during the Soviet occupation, during the financing of the Mujahideen, and you listen to what President Zia had to say about, his goals for the region, Islamizing the entire region, becoming the hegemon of the region, carrying the pan-Islamic vision from Pakistan all the way up to Turkey. And these are the kinds of things that were very well known at the time. And so this whole idea of drawing these extremists from all over the world to Pakistan and then allowing them to really effectively choose who was going to get the financing in Afghanistan, and that included, all 7 of the extremist groups. None of the moderates have ever been given any kind of attention at all, and it's for good reason, because the moderates were the ones who had always run Afghanistan.
The next point is to start helping Afghans in a way they can understand, see, and appreciate. The way humanitarian aid is now delivered appears designed to fail. It certainly has failed. After 8 years of the United States being in there, a recent report by the Georgetown Center for International Strategic Studies gave a summary of Afghan economic realities. I will read off some of these. These are current. 55% have no electricity whatsoever in their homes, and just 1 in 20 has power all day. This is in the entire country of Afghanistan. Imagine that. Only 1 in 20 persons has power all day. More than half report incomes of less than the equivalent of $100 a month. 93% of the population is under $300. 59% have no formal education. 48% cannot read. The affordability of food is worsening. 63% of Afghans say they cannot afford to buy all or even some, but not all the food they need, up 9 points from late 2007, and 63% report adequate availability of food is down from 82% in 2006. Fuel prices are a major problem. 68% say they can't afford the fuel they need for cooking or heat, or a serious issue in the cold Afghan winter. 29% say that there is a good supply of jobs or economic opportunities in their area. That's just 29% of the population say that they can find a job. And the number who characterize their economic opportunities say as very bad has doubled since 2006, from 17% to 33% now. The electricity supply is steadily the single biggest complaint, along with economic opportunity and prices. Another poorly rated area is the support for agriculture, such as the availability of seed, fertilizer, and farm equipment, a central concern in a country that's 3/4 rural with food prices so problematic. That is the way in which we need to address the Afghan people. They are looking at a situation now, and they are saying, what's the difference between being killed by a Taliban, whether he's Pakistani, whether he's an Arab, or whether he's another Afghan, or being killed by an American? Nobody seems to care. Point number 5, declare the global war on terror, the long war, and the global struggle against violent extremism to be over. This will be greeted by a collective sigh of relief by most of the world, especially the American public. The Obama administration has actually done that. They have actually, I'm sure they read our book and they took that as a recommendation. I'm also sure that it will simply not change the situation in terms of military conflict. The name will be changed. The global war on terror has been changed to something else.
I think it's the global war on Al-Qaeda. I think they.
I think it has. It's the global war on Al-Qaeda.
Right. They're now.
The focus has now become on Al-Qaeda, but the issue comes down to the issue of making war on anything, and that's the point.
As a solution.
That's the point that we wanted to make in this. We have used the metaphor of making war since the end of World War II. We have had a war on poverty. We have had a war on cancer. We have had a war on drugs. We have had a war on just about anything we could think of, and instead of resolving these issues, we still have more of them than we ever had to begin with. So I think we really have to go back to the underlying assumptions about the validity of war and making war, and that we really have to start looking for different metaphors. And that we'll discuss this later in terms of how that plays into the 21st chapter. But that's a very big part of what we need to evolve as a human race, to begin to look at these issues outside the arena of conflict.
And conflict really represents the dualism, which is them against us, good against evil, and it's a very simplistic. It does not have the ability to handle the true complex nature of the world that we really live in.
Point number 6 is address the conceptual blurring, determine exactly what the United States hopes to accomplish, and settle on one foreign policy as opposed to many competing goals. From the 1980s on, the United States has at once fostered Pakistan's strategic goals for controlling Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia's extreme religious goals for converting Asia to Islam, and UNICAL's financial goals of building pipelines. Is the United States interested in a peaceful settlement to the Afghan question, or just controlling Shiite Iranian oil for Saudi American oil executives? This is a problem, I think, that is now going on inside the Obama administration, and I think one of the things we're seeing why the policy has been shifting. The original policy was referred to AFPAC, where Pakistan was brought into the mix in terms of what needed to be done to Afghanistan, because so much of the insurgency, of course, was residing in Pakistan, which it did during the 1980s, and it was now. And it was moving across the border and attacking American forces. This issue has to be dealt with, needless to say, with the Pakistani military. The Pakistani military has been using terrorism and has been using terrorist methods and training in terror training camps.
Paul, excuse me for butting in, but we are almost out of time. Let's pick up at exactly this point on side 2.
Okay.
Here our ally in the war on, quote, war on terror, unquote, is actually the cat's paw for the Taliban. Invisible History. Tell us about the website, and then let's resume this in side 2.
InvisibleHistory.com is where you can find out everything you need to know about our book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story.
And we've been speaking with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the co-authors of the just-published Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, out in softcover from City Light Books. For Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening. This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 685. Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 685, interview number 4 with Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the author of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just released in softcover by City Lights Books. Elizabeth and Paul, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
When we left off on Side 2, we were talking about the various numerical points. You take a number of large points or significant points and number them, and these are recommendations to President Obama. And one of the things we were talking about when we left off, and that is the Pakistani role in this entire thing. Of course, people can tune in a television broadcast or a radio broadcast, or they can pick up a newspaper or go to the Internet. and read about the war news that's unfolding in Afghanistan right this minute, American fighting forces as well as NATO fighting forces are engaged in combat against the Taliban. And yet one of our major allies in the war on terror, and it goes through that concept is something you addressed, is Pakistan and of course also Saudi Arabia. And as you point out, the Taliban are basically an extension of the Pakistani national security establishment. So why don't we start in with this? I don't know if Orwellian or Orwell or Lewis and Carroll would be quite the precedent for something like this, but it is as bizarre as it is potentially deadly.
There's no question about that, and that is finally being recognized by, some of the people. Bruce Riedel, the creator of AFPAC, actually looks at that situation, and he's got a lot of stuff out there right now, and he's looking at the situation and saying, we've kind of our relationship with Afghanistan has really kind of been this on again, off again relationship, but the truth is that on a covert basis, it's always been on. It's been on since 1947. One of the things we cite in the book is an example where at the end of World War II, the British military introduced the Punjabi military leaders to the Americans and said, these are our guys, these are the guys you're going to be working with. They're going to hold fast to the principles and the policies of what's going on and what we were trying to establish in India, and you're going to pick up that responsibility. So the United States didn't even blink at that. The United States was eager to pick these things up, but of course it didn't have the 100-year history as of 1847, 110-year history that the British had there, and the background and the sophistication in terms of dealing with the great game, dealing with the sophisticated game that was being played between all these tribal groups, between the Pashtuns and the Punjabis, and between the Tajiks and the Hazara, and the various issues surrounding Afghan nationality, which had existed since 1747. And of course, what's happened since 1947 and Pakistan's creation with the partition of India is that Pakistan has tried to pretend that it was Afghanistan that wasn't a real nation. And you read in the documentation the attitude that were taken by Pakistani leaders when they were set up, because the Pakistanis are backed by Britain and they're backed by the United States. And in 1947, Afghanistan is nothing but this small nation the size of Texas that is pretty much on its own. It's trying to maintain its independence against British colonialism and against the Soviet Union. And it's sitting there, and it's being dictated to by Pakistanis. At one point, I think we cited it in the book, a representative from the Afghan government went over to the Pakistani government and sat down, and they said, look, there's a lot of issues we need to resolve. This was early on, 1948, 1949. We need to resolve these issues, and the Pakistani general just stood up at his desk and he says, I can have my troops in Kabul in an hour if I really wanted to. And that was it. The Afghan diplomat, who was the brother of the prime minister, just simply packed up his briefcase and said, well, that's going to be it, that's going to be it. And that was the beginning of it.
But as bad as that was at the beginning, one difference that needs to be recognized is that throughout the 50s and the 60s, and even into the 70s, you had basically a secular military in Pakistan. But what President Zia brought in was an Islamizing factor, and that is where the whole thing really morphed into something else, where the pan-Islamic agenda that involved the Islamists, and so you're looking at the United States getting involved in a shift in the process, and really was quite willing. In fact, that was part of what the United States and what it supported, certainly through the CIA's involvement with Pakistan's intelligence, definitely supported the idea that these extremist Islamists were necessary in order to beat the Soviets in Afghanistan. And so, you begin to see a process that's just kind of rolling off on its own. But again, because when this occurred, there was no oversight. There was no American press looking at the situation, analyzing it, bringing the information home, getting it into the hands of the public and into the policymakers who could then deal with the true implications of what was going on. The whole thing was just thrown into that. Once again, the dualism was thrown into the good against evil. We're now at war with the evil empire, and the Mujahideen were simply labeled holy warriors, and that was the end of the discussion.
I think Selig Harrison is a long-term Afghan hand. He was the Washington Post's bureau chief, South Asia bureau chief for many, many years, and he is now in Washington at a think tank. And he stated something recently. He summed up why the situation is so bad in between Afghanistan and the United States and Pakistan. And he talked about in March of 1945, Winston Churchill and the British General Staff decided that partition was necessary for strategic reasons. They deliberately set out to create Pakistan because Muhammad al-Jinnah had promised to provide military facilities, and Nehru refused to do so. So this is why Britain became why the United States became allied with Pakistan instead of India during that time period. This is the key to understanding why Pakistan is so dysfunctional. It's an artificial political entity. The British put together 5 ethnic groups that had never coexisted before in the same body politic politically. The Bengalis were the biggest. They outnumbered all the other 4 combined: the Punjabis, the Pashtuns, the Baluch, and the Sindhis. 5 became 4, of course, when Bangladesh succeeded. The army bequeathed by the British to Pakistan was overwhelmingly dominated by Punjabi officers and soldiers. So, with the Bengalis gone, the Baluch, Pashtun, and Sindhis have faced a cruel historical irony. For centuries, they had resisted the incursions of the Mughals into their territories, but now they find themselves ruled by Punjabis who invoke the grandeur of the Mughals to justify their power. Together, the 3 ethnic minorities constitute only 33% of the population, but they consider 72% of Pakistan's territory to be their ancestral home. This is a prescription for built-in conflict.
It certainly sounds like, it certainly is a prescription for built-in conflict. And one of the things to remember, one of the things people should keep in mind, obviously there is someone that lived through the Vietnam War, and with the sanctuaries that have existed for Taliban / Al-Qaeda in the tribal areas, of course, is very reminiscent of some of the geopolitics that obtained during the Vietnam War period. But there's the issue of nukes. Pakistan may be an artificial country. It may be, in many ways, something of a chimera. I may be mispronouncing that. But Pakistan is a nuclear power. And with them actively promoting some of these elements like the Taliban and other Islamic extremists, that is something to give serious thought to. And I think it's one of the things that distinguishes the current situation in Afghanistan from Vietnam.
It raises serious questions about how that even happened. And that's all part of, again, the self-fulfilling prophecy. Since it has nuclear power, therefore we cannot actually deal with them in the manner they need to be dealt with. So, once again, it seems to set up a condition that makes it impossible to change the condition.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Bruce Riedel, I mentioned him earlier. He came out with a piece on the national interest a short time ago, back in June, and his title was Armageddon in Islamabad. And he says, I now think Al-Qaeda can be marching Benazir Bhutto, he starts out by saying, Benazir Bhutto said in 2007, I think Al-Qaeda can now be marching on Islamabad in 2 to 4 years. Before this interview could even be published, she was murdered, most likely by Pakistani Taliban, an Al-Qaeda ally. Pakistan, as an Islamic extremist safe haven, would bolster Al-Qaeda's capabilities tenfold. The jihadist threat bred in Afghanistan would be a cakewalk in comparison. The old Afghan sanctuary was remote, landlocked, and weak. A new one in Pakistan would be in the Islamic mainstream with a modern communications and transportation infrastructure linking it to the world. The threat would be almost unfathomable. The implications would be literally felt around the globe. American options for dealing with such a state would be limited and costly. He goes on to explain. Now, Bruce Riedel is the architect of AFPAC. He came in with the Obama administration and has been developing these theories for years. But the fact is that as we've discussed earlier, Dave, is that Pakistan, Afghanistan is no Vietnam. And in terms of the greater situation and America's position in the world, following the defeat in Vietnam, the United States pretty much went along, the world went along pretty much as it had been before. And the truth is that, when you really looked at the Vietnam situation, it was really an issue of a civil war between North and South. and that Ho Chi Minh had just devoted himself to unifying his country and creating one nation. That is not the case here. We are dealing with an international movement of extremist movement, which is bent on conquest of a large swath of area from the so-called Arc of Crisis, the northern boundaries of Eurasia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all the way down into Africa.
And we can thank Dr. Zbigniew-Brzezinski for really inaugurating this and putting it into this last final stage, because this is really where the whole relationship between, he pulled in the China card, the whole idea of inviting the Islamists, the Al-Qaeda database that was used by the United States and the Saudis to invite the Islamists, that they actually came up with a theory that believed it was best to do this, to create this pot, this stew of Islamic extremists in Pakistan.
You must recall that in the fall of 1979, right prior to the Soviet so-called invasion of Afghanistan, that Pakistan had the American embassy had been burnt to the ground in Islamabad. Pakistan had become a pariah state in the West in terms of their nuclear weapons programs, in terms of their support for various terror groups that were involved in India and Afghanistan. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, once again, this is one of the things we noticed. It was like a light bulb went on. Suddenly, oh my God, we have to align ourselves with Pakistan against the Soviet invasion. Of course, so, this is the way history is made. It's manufactured, and that's what this was. This was a manufactured situation whereby there were large forces at work. And I know that one of the things you mentioned about that was that you wanted to discuss was how these organizations work as proxies for larger Western goals. And I think that this is one of the examples. It's almost a mirror image. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Afghanistan, the way we supported these extremist groups and encouraged them and introduced them to various kinds of international trade routes for access, for exports of their main product in order to fund their efforts, all these things that were done, and then looked the other way, of course, when all these things happened. And then when they defeated the Soviet Union, looked the other way when they tried to establish a government. These are the various things that, they're very convenient. What is the term? Credible deniability. The United States, the CIA has credible deniability when it comes to saying, that the United States really wasn't behind the creation of the Taliban, or really weren't behind the creation of these international organizations, simply because they had been privatized. Of course, at that point, as we discussed before in some of the earlier programs, is that these organizations had been privatized intentionally in order to avoid implicating governments in Europe or the United States. And as a result of that, we are now living with that kind of privatization to the point where American involvement, and I say that, quote, American involvement, is really almost like a public relations moniker for what we're involved in. There are so many privatized interests that have become established in that area, whether it's the international narcotics trade or whether it's the international oil industry and the pipeline industry. These are all things that have all combined. Their interests make strange bedfellows, I guess is what you could say. But, the freedom-loving independent American administrations getting together with Wahhabist Saudi Arabians in the name of defeating communism is one thing back in the 1980s, but now suddenly it gets very complicated when we're dealing with extremist Muslim politicians that we want to work with on the one hand in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then those guys, those extremist Muslim politicians who basically want to overthrow Western installed democracies or Western backed democracies in that part of the world as well. So we're treading a very fine line, and the United States has been doing that since the Clinton administration, trying to pick so-called good Taliban from the bad Taliban, and of course at the same time fight Al-Qaeda. A recent analysis by someone basically said that at this point the difference that the United States and Pakistan are really not on the same page on this issue, because the good Taliban, to Pakistan, the good Taliban are the Taliban that attack NATO and the United States forces, and the bad Taliban are their own Taliban, which attacks the Pakistani military. So, we're dealing with a very confused and very confusing situation. And it's hard to see how that's actually going to straighten out in the near future.
This, again, just to emphasize why it's so critical to understand the Pakistani role in this, its relationship to the United States, and how that really is still playing out today and still interfering with anything that really can bring the kind of stability and rebuilding we need in Afghanistan.
And that really kind of gets us to the next point, the next series of points, and that is, getting everybody on the same page, and that everybody is not just Pakistan and the United States and Afghanistan, it's also Russia, China, Iran, all the interest, India, the various nations who have an interest in that region and trying to create some kind of stability. I mean, everybody has an interest in stability in that region.
But you see, once again, this is where Zbigniew Brzezinski really comes up, and the kind of agenda that he would look at, which would prefer to keep the containment theories of the Cold War era still in play in that region, which means keeping Russia out as a real active partner and keeping China in some kind of tight control vis-a-vis the United States. So, in terms of trying to bring genuine stability to the region versus continuing effectively the Great Game is really part of the, what we're realizing is still at play very much, especially with Brzezinski. And he's still influencing the Obama administration.
Two quick points of the many recommendations that you make. Some people have advocated negotiating with the Taliban, and you highlight just how problematic that can be because you cite the fates of some of those would-be negotiators.
Yes, exactly. The fact is that who exactly the Taliban are is not an established issue. Once again, there's been a lot of public relations. Pakistan's military is well known for its very advanced public relations campaign in terms of advancing its own interests in the Western media. In fact, Richard Holbrooke just recently complained that both the Indian and Pakistani lobbyists in Washington were really inhibiting him in terms of his ability to make adequate foreign policy for and resolve issues in that part of the world for Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has always kind of been the odd man out when it comes to that sort of thing, and that continues to be the case.
You make a very interesting recommendation, or actually I think you cite a recommendation made by someone else, to deal with the narcotics traffic.
Well, the narcotics traffic at this point is also something that is up for grabs. The Bush administration was in favor of actually burning down crops or defoliating crops of Afghan peasants. This was, of course, another self-defeating example of policy coming out of Washington, whereby they were attacking the poorest link in the chain, the poor Afghan farmers who had no other means of livelihood. And as a result of that, they were easily recruited for the Taliban. Not to mention the fact that the drugs they were using to defoliate were sickening their cattle and the children who lived in these various areas where the United States was spraying this stuff. And so as a result of that, that has really proved that's pretty much shifted around at this point. I believe the Obama administration has now announced, I believe as of a week ago anyway, that they've announced that they're going to start tracking drug traffickers, following these people and into Pakistan and other parts of the world where these traffickers are moving, because they are responsible for supporting and supplying the money for the insurgency at this point. Everything is linked to everything else in this process. And so the issue is, what do you do with the poor Afghan farmer or the poor Pakistani farmer whose life relies on growing drugs, on growing opium as an example, to turn into heroin?
And this does tie back in again. The lack of the proper reconstruction, the roads being rebuilt, is one of the key reasons that many of these farmers were stuck. The only cash crop that they could grow were the poppies, because the poppies they could always sell them, but they could not get their fresh produce to market because the roads were destroyed. So this, once again, is just showing you how it perpetuates the problem because the fundamentals have not been done.
And needless to say, for in terms of supplying troops versus going in there and actually paying the Afghan farmers and buying their crops from them, while at the same time giving them the opportunity to plant other crops, providing them with the seed, with the manufacturing equipment so that they can get their fields plowed. These are things that the United States could do. I mean, we have, and I read just today where we've got this massive overcapacity in terms of our industrial output. I mean, we've got factory capacity that simply cannot be matched. We could be producing, as an example, tractors or just very small scale manufacturing operations that could be producing these things very inexpensively for places like Afghanistan. It's an issue of economics. There's just no interest in the world financial markets to actually resolving these problems in a practical way. We certainly have the technology. We have the people who know how to do it. There's just simply no will on behalf of the financial movers and shakers in this globe to start sharing the wealth in some very fundamental basic ways. And once again, that plays into the 21st chapter. That plays into the idea that we're really going to have to, unless we're going to spend the rest of our days here warring with each other and manufacturing weapons of mass destruction everywhere, or even minor destruction, in supplying everybody in the world with a Kalashnikov. I'd rather much see everyone who needs one to start their own farming operation be supplied with a tractor than a Kalashnikov. I think it would be much more practical and much more useful, at least for the long term anyway, which is, I think, what most of us are in it for.
21st chapter. We've got about 7-8 minutes left in the interview. Tell us what the 21st chapter alludes to, and let's see if we can, in these last couple of minutes, sort of provide a 21st chapter for this interview, which many people may have found overwhelming and or these interviews, which many people may have found overwhelming and or depressing.
Well, we didn't want to overwhelm or depress anybody, as you know, Dave. We're very upbeat about the future and the potential for human beings. And that plays very much into what the idea of the 21st chapter came from. When we went back to Afghanistan in 2002 with Seema Wali to film her story, her return, she was one of the first exiles. She was the first exile out of Afghanistan in 1978 after the Marxist coup, because her family had been aligned with the West and with the United States specifically. The hotel we were staying at had whitewashed walls, and there was a local Afghan artist who was painting on the walls of the stairwell. In the first week we were there, he painted the New York City Fire Department logo, and the second week we were there, on the second floor stairwell, he painted the New York Police Department logo, and the third week we were there, as we're walking up to our rooms at the end of the day, he's painting the image of the villain from the 1970 Stanley Kubrick movie A Clockwork Orange, with the face, the English gentleman Alec was his name, Alexander Delage, with his bowler hat and his grin and wicked grin, and pointing a knife out towards you. And I thought to myself, what a strange thing to be doing. The book had been written, of course, by Anthony Burgess in the 1960s. And it was very much, I remember reading it, I'm sure you read it back then. Mm-hmm. Burgess invented an entire language, and it was all about the evolution of what was happening to Britain and Western society, Western civilization. And it was a mockery of how the youth of the era were mocking the times and the efforts by the bureaucracy to establish law and order and justice, when they knew full well that it was nothing but total hypocrisy, that they weren't establishing anything that was really worth any value of restoring. And there were allusions in the movie and in the book about the kind of control that the state was imposing upon people, the use of violence, bringing thugs into the police force in order to administer violence upon the population at will, in order to control them. And so when I saw that, I went back and I bought another copy of the book, and we reread the book, and there Anthony Burgess mentions the fact in a new introduction to the book, which he'd written quite late on in the early 1990s, that the book was published in the United States with only 20 chapters. Everywhere else in the world, the book had been published with 21 chapters, the 21st chapter being the chapter of redemption, that the evil Alex had reached the age of 21, and the violence that he had experienced and that he so craved and loved as he was growing up as a youth, what he referred to as the ultra-violence, he began to develop a distaste for. And he attributed that, Kubrick attributed that to Stanley Kubrick in the movie attributed that, Burgess attributed that to the whole idea that this was something that the human race was, that we actually were evolving as human beings, and that we were evolving as society, and that when we somehow would reach the 21st century, that we would evolve out of the desire to solve our problems through violence. Well, unfortunately, Kubrick made the movie with only 20 chapters, with only the 20th chapter, and which he meant it as a political metaphor. And in fact, he states that. He says that during the time period when it was being done, he said his book was Kennedyan. Kennedyan in the sense that it saw that every human being had the ability to refine himself and reform himself into something better, that we could make a better world. But that the movie had turned out to be very Nixonian, that it was very much evil prancing on the page from the very beginning until the very end. So that became a metaphor for what we felt Afghanistan was really all about. Here, the United States in 2001 winds up in this place that has been under siege by Western civilization since Alexander the Great in the 3rd millennium BC. And here we are, finally, in August of 2009, with the general who is in charge of the ultra-violence which we are wielding upon the Afghan people, is finally saying, we can't win this thing militarily, especially if we are using violence to hurt the Afghan people. We have to suddenly change the way in which we do it. So this is a very, very, very critical moment in time, not just for Afghanistan and America's involvement there, but as you know, for the United States as well, in terms of whether we can mature as a society and a civilization. And we must recall as well what the 21st chapter meant to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not survive its effort in Afghanistan. It went in there with its own ideals and its own principles, with the intention of turning Afghanistan into a pro-Soviet socialist state. That didn't happen. But the United States seems to be very unclear as to what exactly it wants to do in Afghanistan and what it wants to do with its ally Pakistan, and whether it wants to advance the cause of extremist Islam, which it did in the 1980s, or whether it really wants to establish a modern, westernized state, which we know from our own experience is very much what the Afghan people want, despite what we hear from a lot of people in the media. We know full well that the Afghan people are very much involved with democracy and always have been, and that their efforts to establish an independent state has been at issue from the very beginning, and that's what we need to get behind if there's going to be an end to this conflict.
And so we are almost out of time. Give us the website. And by the way, we have in these 4 interviews just scratched the surface of the book. I think we've done a pretty good job of laying out information, but there's a whole lot more there. Tell the audience where they can find it.
Well, you can find the book and a lot more information about us at invisiblehistory.com.
And hopefully the audience themselves can become the 21st chapter for this entire story.
We certainly hope so.
Well, it's going to take all of us to do it.
Exactly.
That's for sure, and that's why we wrote the book.
Well, you've done a magnificent job, and with holiday season looming on the horizon, I can't encourage people strongly enough to consider this book as a holiday gift for whatever faith or in the context that you give such gifts. We have been visiting with Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the co-authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just out in softcover by City Lights Books. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 685, interview number 4 with Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. For Paul and Elizabeth, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.
Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Pakistan is actively still allowing the Islamists to go over their border, and the Taliban, and supporting the Taliban and all of the abuses that are going on. So you've got a lot of problems that are still really going to be a continuing problem, whether the U.S. continues what it's doing right now or whether the U.S. withdraws. This is still going to be a continuing problem. So the real issue is, what should the United States do to actually try and correct what is going on? And that is where we see a schism in U.S. policy, U.S. stated goals, and what we actually see on the ground. And that is where, we get very I think, there have been so many common sense and obvious recommendations over the last 20 years. We really have to start asking the question, why isn't it that any administration can actually implement these obvious solutions to the problem?
I'm going to go and look at the points that we do when we sum up, Dave. And the first point that we make to President Obama is that the United States stop killing Afghans. That's a complex story, as we know. Okay, well, the Afghans are a friend of ours who was involved in the Reconstruction effort very early on at one point expressed amazement. He's an Afghan, and he said, I don't understand why the United States is conducting these bombing raids in these outlying areas of Afghanistan. He said, the United States isn't at war with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is America's ally. So, but the fact is that the United States
invasion through the entire Mujahideen war against the Red Army, right on up to the present, and how the current Afghan government has many of its top officials astride the heroin trade. Your book is very critical of U.S. policy, and beyond that, it's a very sober, detailed critique of said U.S. policy. Yet I think that in the chapter where you say, what can President Obama do, and I'd like to focus on that in a big way, you do not do something that I wager most of the listeners who've heard our previous 3 hours together would have thought that you were in favor of an outright withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in fact, at one point you highlight the deadly futility of attempting to negotiate with the Taliban, which a lot of people have tried to do with no success whatsoever. Let's take a look at what you recommend to President Obama and what you feel should be done in light of what you've presented in the book. And at some point before we wrap this interview, I'd like you to give this series of interviews what you do in your book, which is a 21st chapter. And I'm going to have you explain, when we get to that point in the interview, I'm going to have you explain what the 21st chapter means in the context specifically of your book so that listeners will understand that. You speak directly to President Obama and his policies there. Let's talk about that. What do you recommend? Just sort of go marching through Georgia, so to speak. What do you recommend to President Obama?
Well, I think at this point, we've been looking at this crisis in Afghanistan going back to, in terms of U.S. policy being directly involved, going back to the Carter administration. And so we can see the hand of policy being really the problem. And in terms of correcting Obama's policy, we can see that this lineage that has gone back so far, really, it is as if it's handed over generationally, that it really doesn't matter Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. These things really make no difference in terms of the overarching direction of the policy. And I think we've now seen that transition from George Bush, who, of course, in basically underfinancing and really underfocusing on Afghanistan in any genuine way, really created the crisis that Obama was handed. So now we've got Obama. Well, Obama seems to be replicating a lot of the same problems. And as we see it at this point, the best example of that, of course, was the hue and cry over civilian casualties. We've been hearing this as one of the major concerns. The Afghan people also have been subjected to, since 2001, when the Americans came in and the Europeans came in terms of reconstruction, really not completing reconstruction. So once again, we've got a lot of complex issues here. And that's why when we hear this talk about the U.S. withdrawal, okay, it isn't so much that we certainly recognize that there is no military solution to this, but we're talking now about a situation that has really, this is like you've got a blown up building, okay, and you've really got to bring in some major reconstruction to rebuild it, okay. This is the Afghan civil society. This has not been done. You have got porous borders between.
Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 685. Interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. This is interview number 4, being recorded on August 16th of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just out in softcover from City Light Books. Elizabeth, Paul, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's great to be back.
Thanks, Dave.
As we're talking on, well, you know what, first give your website, and then let's sort of go traipsing through Afghanistan, which a lot of people have tried to do with varying degrees of success.
Okay, the website's invisiblehistory.com. That's it.
All right. And over the course of the previous 3 hours that we've spent together, we've delved into a lot of the subject material of your book. For people that don't know much about Afghanistan, and I basically have to include myself in that category, it provides a pretty detailed history of that country, going way, way, way back, and then sort of brings it up through the present. But we've taken a look at how the Soviet march to the Middle East, supposedly going somehow through Afghanistan, was actually manufactured. It was a propaganda ploy. And we've taken a look at Team B and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the luring in and the trapping of the Soviets. Then we've looked at Unocal and some of the corporate interests who began picking up the thread from that point. We've taken a look at the Pakistanis. We've taken a look at the tremendous role that the narcotics traffic has played in this entire concatenation from the period leading up to the Soviet.
Is acting as if it's at war with Afghanistan. In fact, what the United States is acting as if it's at war with the Pashtun majority of Afghanistan, and that comes down to British policy in the 19th century. The Anglo-Saxon world, and that's how they refer to themselves, the Anglo-Saxon financial industry, the Anglo-Saxon military industry, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada. Britain has been waging war on the Pashtun population of Afghanistan, which was the ruling population of Afghanistan, since 1839. I will read you something that is just in front of me. This is an extract from a report of the East India Company, a committee on the causes and consequences of the first Afghan war. This was written during its progress. This was written during the progress of the war in 1839 to 1842. Quote, "This war of robbery is waged by the English government through the intervention of the government of India, without the knowledge of England or of the Parliament or the Court of Directors, thereby evading the checks placed by the Constitution on the exercise of the prerogative of the Crown in declaring war. It presents, therefore, a new crime in the annals of nations, a secret war. It has been made by a people without their knowledge against another people who had committed no offense." Now, Liz, you've got a quote here from Alexander Burns that was written.
Right. This actually, Alexander Burns was a political officer for the East India Company, and he was in advance of really, getting the British Empire was already in the region during the early 19th century. This was in 1832.